On September 25, 1918, during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the skies over northeastern France were thick with smoke, fog, and the rumble of artillery. Among the scattered clouds, a lone SPAD-13 fighter roared into position, its pilot poised for action. That pilot was Edward Vernon Rickenbacker, a 27-year-old American who had already demonstrated remarkable skill in a series of aerial combats, but was about to solidify his place as America's top fighter pilot in World War I. On that morning, Rickenbacker faced a formation of 7 German aircraft, including reconnaissance planes protected by Fokker D-7s, Germany's premier fighter of the era. In a daring display of precision, timing, and nerve, he engaged the formation, shooting down 3 enemy planes in a single mission, an extraordinary achievement that showcased not only his skill, but also his deep understanding of aerial tactics. This feat pushed his confirmed kills toward 26, establishing him as the most successful American pilot of the war. But Rickenbacker's heroism in the sky did not appear overnight. It was the result of a lifetime of preparation, persistence, and courage. From his early years tinkering with engines in Columbus, Ohio, to surviving the perils of high-speed auto racing, and finally mastering the chaotic, dangerous world of World War I aerial combat. Edward Vernon Rickenbacker was born on October 8, 1890, in Columbus, Ohio, to Swiss immigrant parents. His father, Adolf Rickenbacker, instilled a strong work ethic, and his mother, Ida, managed the household and children after Adolf passed away when Eddie was just 12 years old. The loss forced young Eddie to contribute to the family's survival, taking on jobs in local factories and repair shops. From an early age, he demonstrated an unusual aptitude for mechanics, often dismantling and rebuilding bicycles and small engines to understand how they worked. These experiences fostered his problem-solving skills, attention to detail, and patience, traits that would later be vital in high-stakes aviation. Eddie's fascination with speed and risk led him to professional auto racing in his early 20s. Competing in events such as the Indianapolis 500, he honed his reflexes, decision-making, and composure under pressure, all qualities that translated directly to the cockpit. Racing also reinforced his ability to remain calm while making split-second calculations under dangerous conditions. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, Rickenbacker sought to serve his country. Initially rejected by the U.S. Army Air Service for lack of formal education, he enlisted as a driver, transporting officers in France. His skill, intelligence, and mechanical expertise quickly earned recognition, and he was granted the opportunity to train as a pilot. At Issoudun Airdrome, the largest U.S. flight training base in France, Eddie faced intense challenges. The airfields were primitive, aircraft were unreliable, and accidents among trainees were common. Drawing on his mechanical knowledge and experience with high-risk racing, he mastered aircraft like the Nieuport 28 and later the SPAD-13. Learning critical skills in pre-flight checks, engine management, and emergency procedures. By combining discipline with a methodical approach to flight, Eddie prepared himself for the dangers of aerial combat, laying the foundation for his future success as America's ace of aces. After completing training, Rickenbacker joined the 94th Aero Squadron, the Hat-in-the-Ring Squadron. His initial combat patrols were tests of skill, nerve, and endurance. On April 29, 1918, he engaged a German reconnaissance plane over Toul, France. Applying careful positioning, timing, and fire discipline, he successfully downed the enemy aircraft, recording his first confirmed victory. Unlike many young pilots who celebrated impulsively, Rickenbacker studied the engagement afterward, analyzing what worked, what failed, and how to improve. Over the following months, he faced increasingly dangerous situations. During one encounter in June, he confronted a formation of 4 Fokker D-7s, Germany's most formidable fighters. By executing coordinated climbs, dives, and turns, he successfully shot down 2 enemy aircraft, further establishing his reputation as a skilled, methodical, and daring pilot. These experiences emphasized careful planning, observation, and precision, hallmarks of Rickenbacker's combat style that would define his legendary status as America's ace of aces.
When Eddie Rickenbacker completed his first combat patrols with the 94th Aero Squadron, he was still known by many as the race car driver turned pilot, a man with a reputation for mechanical genius and raw courage, but not yet the legend he would become. The early missions were quiet, tense, and filled with uncertainty. The front lines of northeastern France were carved by trenches, smoke, and artillery flashes that lit the horizon day and night. Above all of it, the skies belonged to whoever dared to challenge the German air service, a formidable foe equipped with highly trained pilots and the deadly Fokker D-7, arguably the most advanced fighter of the war. But Rickenbacker was determined. His fascination with machinery, his competitive nature, and his relentless self-discipline pushed him to master the art of aerial combat in a way that set him apart from many first-time pilots. He had not joined the air service simply to fly. He had joined to fight and to win. On April 19, 1918, Eddie Rickenbacker took part in a patrol over Toul, France, flying his Nieuport 28, a nimble but fragile aircraft known for its tendency to shed fabric from its upper wing during steep dives. For days, he had been studying the movements of enemy reconnaissance planes that flew routine observation missions over Allied territory. These missions were crucial to German artillery coordination, and disrupting them was a priority. During this patrol, Rickenbacker spotted a German Pals reconnaissance plane at a lower altitude. He kept his airplane steady, maintaining position until he had a clear advantage. He approached from above and behind, the safest and most lethal angle, and fired a controlled burst from his twin Vickers machine guns. The German plane wobbled, dipped, and then spiraled downward. It crashed behind enemy lines, marking Rickenbacker's first confirmed kill. This moment was not just a victory, it was a transformation. Many pilots fired wildly in their first engagements, overwhelmed by adrenaline or fear. Rickenbacker's methodical approach showed discipline. He didn't waste ammunition, didn't rush, and didn't put himself at unnecessary risk. He demonstrated what would become his signature style: effective, calculated, decisive. Just weeks later, he would achieve the milestone that every pilot dreamed of and feared, becoming an ace. On May 28, 1918, Rickenbacker encountered two German aircraft near the front. He executed a rapid climb, gaining altitude until he had the advantage. He dove into the first plane, firing a short, precise burst that sent it tumbling. Moments later, he pulled upward, turned sharply, and struck down the second enemy aircraft. 2 confirmed kills in one flight elevated his total to 5, the official threshold for an ace. But unlike some pilots who let the title inflate their ego, Rickenbacker responded with humility. He didn't celebrate. Instead, he returned to base, wrote down every detail about the engagement in his notebook, and immediately began analyzing how he could perform even better. At a time when many pilots fought based on instinct alone, Rickenbacker treated aerial combat like a science. He understood that luck favored the prepared, and the pilots who survived were the ones who combined courage with strategy. One of his greatest strengths was his ability to read the enemy. Rickenbacker studied German aircraft silhouettes, wing shapes, climb angles, and propeller sounds. He could distinguish a Fokker from an albatross at a distance, sometimes before other pilots even notice an aircraft was present. This gave him an unmatched ability to position himself for engagement or disengagement. His mechanical background also became a crucial advantage. He understood the strengths and weaknesses of his aircraft, especially after transitioning from the Newport 28 to the more powerful Spad 13, armed with twin 30-caliber machine guns and capable of speeds up to 135 miles per hour. The Spad was not as maneuverable as some of its opponents, but it excelled in diving attacks, and Rickenbacker used this strength to brutal effect. He rarely engaged in turning dogfights. Instead, he preferred fast, decisive strikes. Altitude first. Surprise second. Controlled burst of fire. Immediate climb or disengagement. These disciplined tactics allowed him to fight more aggressively without exposing himself to unnecessary danger. He also practiced memorizing sun angles at different times of day, learning how to approach enemies with the sun behind him to blind their view. He trained himself to scan the sky in constant shifting patterns, ensuring no enemy fighter could ambush him. This combination of mechanical mastery, tactical patience, and situational awareness made him one of the deadliest pilots in the U.S. Air Service. By early summer of 1918, the tempo of aerial combat had intensified. German pilots increased their patrols ahead of planned offensives, and American pilots were flying more missions than ever. One of Rickenbacker's defining engagements occurred in June 1918. During a patrol, he and his wingmen spotted a flight of 4 Fokker D-7s escorting a German observation aircraft. The Fokker D-7 was feared across the Western Front. Its engine provided excellent climb rates, and its maneuverability made it a dangerous opponent. Instead of retreating, Rickenbacker devised a plan. He signaled his wingmen to maintain formation and executed a shallow climb, maneuvering above the German flight. As the Fokkers focused on his wingmen below, he dove toward the escorting formation, catching them off guard. His first burst struck the lead escort fighter, sending it spinning downward. He quickly pulled up, rolled to one side, and targeted a second enemy fighter. The Germans, momentarily disoriented, struggled to regain formation. Rickenbacker pressed the advantage. His precise and controlled bursts crippled the second Fokker, sending it into a dive it could not recover from. With 2 enemy fighters falling away and the German formation broken, the remaining enemies retreated. This victory was more than another tally. It was a demonstration of his supreme understanding of aerial combat dynamics. He had attacked the formation at its weakest point, using surprise and altitude to eliminate the most dangerous aircraft first. Throughout late June and early July, Rickenbacker continued to accumulate victories. He shot down additional reconnaissance planes and fighters, demonstrating a keen understanding of target prioritization. He often targeted observation aircraft first, knowing their destruction would disrupt German ground coordination more than a fighter kill. Every successful mission reinforced his growing reputation among the Allies and intensified German efforts to identify and eliminate him. But Rickenbacker's discipline and preparation kept him alive. Life at the 94th Aero Squadron was far from glamorous. Pilots slept in makeshift huts or drafty barracks near muddy airfields. Mechanics worked long hours in harsh conditions, battling weather, shortages, and constant pressure to keep aircraft operational. Rickenbacker was deeply involved in this process. His mechanical expertise made him valuable beyond the cockpit. He often assisted ground crews, diagnosing mechanical issues or improving engine performance. His interest in every detail, from spark plugs to control cables, made him one of the most prepared pilots in the unit. The squadron's daily rhythm was a mix of tension and routine. Wake up early, review weather reports, examine aircraft, briefings, patrols, debriefings, writing mission reports. In between, pilots coped with the psychological strain in their own ways. Some wrote letters, others engaged in dark humor. Many kept small journals, Rickenbacker included, filled with technical notes, observations, and reflections on combat. His notebooks reveal a mind constantly analyzing and refining tactics. After every engagement, he wrote down enemy aircraft types, estimated altitudes, attack angles, gun bursts used, enemy reactions, mistakes, improvements for next time. This meticulous documentation set him apart from other pilots, many of whom relied on instinct alone. To Rickenbacker, every detail mattered, because every detail meant a better chance of survival. By late summer, Rickenbacker had internalized several fundamental truths about air combat. These lessons not only shaped his own approach, but influenced squadron tactics as a whole. Altitude is everything. Altitude meant control. Whoever held the higher position dictated the terms of engagement. Rickenbacker rarely entered a fight without it. Surprise wins battles. Most of his kills came from ambush attacks from above or behind. A pilot who never saw him coming was a pilot who couldn't fight back. Short and precise bursts. Ammunition was limited and jams were common. Rickenbacker emphasized firing only when absolutely certain of hitting the target. Avoid turn fights. Dogfights were chaotic and dangerous. Rickenbacker used the Spads 13 speed to dive, stripe, and climb away rather than engage in circular maneuvers. Teamwork equals survival. He encouraged squadron members to fly in coordinated formations, watch each other's blind spots, and share information from every patrol. These principles weren't just effective, they were life-saving, and they prepared him for the more dangerous missions that lay ahead.
By the summer of 1918, the war in the air had transformed into something far more complex than the duels of 1916 or the reckless chivalry that had defined the early days of aviation combat. Germany's Jagdstaffeln had become more disciplined. The pilots were no longer knights of the air. They were sharpened weapons molded by years of relentless conflict. They flew in coordinated groups, operated under precise tactical doctrines, and relied on aircraft engineered with deadly improvements. And yet, at this exact moment, when German air power was arguably at its strongest, Eddie Rickenbacker's ascent began. Not gradually, not cautiously, but with a sudden, unmistakable shift that left both American and German observers stunned. This was the period during which Rickenbacker transformed from a competent pilot into the ace of aces, earning 26 confirmed victories, more than any other American in the war. And what makes this rise so compelling is that it wasn't defined by recklessness or bravado. It was defined by precision, discipline, and an increasingly cold understanding of what it took to survive the air war of 1918. To understand Rickenbacker's meteoric rise, you have to understand the psychological shift that occurred within him after his first handful of victories. In the early months, Rickenbacker flew cautiously, adhering closely to squadron tactics. He relied on formation flying, waited for opportunities, and avoided unnecessary risks. But as the months passed, and especially after his April victories, he began seeing patterns in the chaos. He noticed how German pilots reacted under pressure, how they broke formation, how they favored the sun, how they used clouds as instant cover, how they hesitated when surprised, how they made small, predictable mistakes when forced to defend rather than attack. These weren't isolated observations. They were data points, and Rickenbacker was collecting them obsessively. Every scrap of information, every maneuver, every engagement became part of a growing mental library of German habits and weaknesses. And with each new insight, his confidence shifted from mere survival to controlled dominance. He once wrote in his journal, "The sky is like any battlefield. If you understand the terrain, you understand the enemy." By early July, his flying style changed. He no longer just joined patrols, he shaped them. He no longer waited for opportunities,
he created them. This was the beginning of his offensive phase, a phase that would lead to some of the most carefully executed aerial victories in American history. While Rickenbacker's tactical understanding evolved, another factor contributed to his ascent: his mechanical instincts. He could feel when a plane tugged slightly left on a climb, or when the fuel mixture wasn't burning clean, or when a magneto misfired by a fraction of a second. Most pilots noticed problems seconds before they became deadly. Rickenbacker noticed them minutes earlier. For the SPAD-13, a brutally powerful but temperamental machine, this intuition was priceless. Many pilots complained that the SPAD's Hispano-Suiza engine constantly overheated or jammed. Rickenbacker didn't complain. He adjusted. He experimented. He tinkered with airflow settings, leaned the fuel mix in high-altitude climbs, and adjusted throttle sequences mid-combat. This mechanical fluency gave him confidence, and that confidence translated into aggression, controlled, calculated aggression. July 1918 marked the beginning of what pilots in the 94th Aero Squadron would later call Rickenbacker's summer. It began with a patrol near Chateau Thierry. On a morning thick with haze, Rickenbacker spotted a formation of German Albatros fighters flying a staggered line abreast pattern, an escort for reconnaissance planes further behind. Most pilots avoided these escort formations, attacking them almost guaranteed a counterattack. But Rickenbacker had been studying a specific weakness. Escort pilots expected head-on or high-angle attacks. They were far less prepared for a high-speed, low-angle burst that forced them to break formation. He dove beneath the formation, then pulled up sharply, firing a burst that clipped the lead escort's radiator. The enemy pilot panicked, peeling off suddenly and disrupting the formation's discipline. The moment that formation broke, a split second of vulnerability, enough for Rickenbacker to strike again. He didn't linger in the fight. He didn't push his luck. He made clean, controlled attacks, then escaped into cloud cover before the Germans reorganized. This was how he fought now. Not with thunderous dogfights, but with surgical strikes. That day, he scored 2 kills, clean, precise, coordinated. By the end of July, he had 5 more. The squadron began noticing. The French noticed. The Germans noticed. Word spread through the German Jagdstaffeln stationed in the region that an American pilot with a scarlet SPAD had developed a knack for attacking from unexpected angles. They started calling him der Geisterjäger, the ghost hunter. Not because he appeared suddenly, but because he disappeared just as fast.
Rickenbacker's growing mastery didn't go unnoticed by his commanders. By late summer, he was increasingly trusted to lead patrols. But leadership wasn't merely tactical. It was psychological. The 94th Aero Squadron was exhausted. Casualties were mounting. Germany's spring offensives had left scars. Young pilots arrived with fear in their eyes. Experienced pilots were worn thin by the relentless churn of missions. Rickenbacker stepped into this environment not with bravado, but with discipline. He reorganized pre-flight routines. He introduced mandatory map briefings. He drilled his pilots on formation patterns. He emphasized oxygen management at altitude. He insisted every pilot memorized cloud density reports. He trained them to scan the sky in rhythmic intervals. Some thought he was obsessive. Others later said he saved their lives. One pilot recalled, "He didn't demand we be fearless. He trained us to be prepared, and that's what gave us courage." This was the essence of his leadership, not charisma, not theatrics, but preparation. As Rickenbacker rose through the ranks, Germany introduced a new threat, the Fokker D.7, arguably the most advanced fighter aircraft of the war. It could climb steeply without stalling. It could hang on its propeller in a vertical climb. Its maneuverability was unmatched. Its structural integrity allowed aggressive dives. Many Allied pilots feared it. Rickenbacker respected it, but he didn't fear it. He studied it like a machine. He watched how its pilots flew it. He observed how quickly it lost energy in steep banking turns. He noticed its handling became sluggish after prolonged climbs. This knowledge would become crucial in the coming weeks. One of the most defining moments of Rickenbacker's ascent occurred in late August when he secured 3 victories in 2 days, a period his squadron later described as Rickenbacker's turning point into legend. It began when he encountered a trio of Fokker D.7s escorting a German observation balloon, high-value targets. Rickenbacker didn't attack head-on. He didn't dive straight into a formation that had the altitude advantage. Instead, he reversed the psychology of the encounter. He climbed above them, slipped into cloud cover, waited, watched their patrol rhythm, timed their bank angles. And when one Fokker drifted just slightly from the formation, just far enough to create a pocket of space, Rickenbacker struck. He dove at maximum speed, firing a short burst that severed the Fokker's coolant line. The plane plummeted, trailing smoke. Within minutes, he climbed again, positioned himself, and struck the second Fokker before the surviving escort could react. 2 kills in minutes, a third the next day. The 94th Squadron erupted in celebration, but Rickenbacker's response was cold, professional, almost detached. Only discipline wins a fight, nothing else. He wasn't chasing glory, he was chasing perfection. By September 1918, Rickenbacker had become a phenomenon. He wasn't the fastest, he wasn't the most daring, he wasn't the most charismatic, but he was the most consistent, the most disciplined, the most technically exact. His kill count rose steadily, never in reckless bursts, but in controlled increments. His methods were so efficient that French commanders began studying his combat reports as instructional material. American newspapers back home began referring to him as America's ace, though he himself resisted the label. He believed the Ace of Aces was a title earned only through mastery, not through media praise. And he was still getting better, more observant, more patient, more dangerous. What separated him from every other pilot was this: Rickenbacker didn't fight the enemy, he dismantled them, piece by piece, pattern by pattern, mistake by mistake. His victories were not strokes of luck. They were the result of thousands of tiny decisions, split-second calculations, and mechanical instincts forged over decades of building and racing machines. By the end of September, Rickenbacker had established himself as the deadliest American pilot in the war, but the greatest test still lay ahead. Germany was desperate. Their air force was stretched thin, their pilots were exhausted, their best aces were gone. But they were not finished. In the final weeks of the war, the skies would fill with the last wave of German resistance. They would deploy their final reserves, including elite fighter groups sent specifically to challenge rising Allied aces. And Rickenbacker, now a symbol of American aviation, would become one of their primary targets. He didn't know it yet, but the weeks ahead would bring the most dangerous missions of his life. High-risk reconnaissance, balloon busting, deep penetration patrols, rescue escorts, solo engagements against entire formations. Everything he had learned, every mechanical instinct, every tactical insight, every calculated move, would be tested in a whirlwind of combat that would decide whether he lived long enough to see the war's end. And from this crucible would emerge not just a skilled pilot, but the legend history would remember as America's ace of aces.
The summer of 1918 had changed Eddie Rickenbacker forever. He had entered July as a determined but still developing fighter pilot, learning the rhythms of combat and the psychology of his enemy. But by September, as the Western Front shook under the weight of the final Allied offensives,
Rickenbacker had become something entirely different, a thinking predator, a pilot whose discipline, precision, and instinct had elevated him from capable aviator to rising legend. Here comes the story of his most dangerous period, the phase where Rickenbacker flew solo patrols deep over enemy territory, attacked some of the most heavily defended observation balloons of the war, and engaged German fighters with a level of precision that would cement his status as America's ace of aces. By late September 1918, the Allied command structure was stretched thin. New pilots were arriving with barely any flight experience, while veterans were being rotated out due to fatigue, injury, or death. The 94th Aero Squadron, already one of the most active units, was flying constant daily missions in support of the Saint Mihiel and Meuse-Argonne offensives. Rickenbacker saw a growing problem. The more inexperienced pilots he brought on patrol, the more lives were lost. Young aviators were struggling to maintain formation. They missed signals in combat. They panicked under fire. Some even lost orientation in cloud banks, spiraling into the ground. So Rickenbacker made a decision that only a pilot with deep confidence and deeper discipline would make. He began flying solo missions, not to prove anything, not for glory, but because he believed he could complete certain reconnaissance, interception, and harassment patrols alone, without risking younger pilots. It was a controversial decision. Some officers accused him of recklessness. Others believed he was acting unilaterally. But the results spoke louder than criticism. Rickenbacker's solo patrols became some of the most effective flights of the entire 94th Squadron. He intercepted enemy formations with surgical precision. He disrupted enemy observation flights. He mapped enemy troop buildups. And he repeatedly returned with intelligence that saved American infantry lives. One pilot later wrote, "He flew alone not because he wanted danger. He flew alone because he couldn't bear bringing a younger man to his death." This was the start of Rickenbacker's most remarkable stretch of victories, a period when he found himself outnumbered almost every time he took to the skies. In September 1918, the Meuse-Argonne offensive began, the largest American operation of the war and one of the bloodiest campaigns in U.S. history. The sky above the Argonne forest was a chaotic, deadly place. German fighters flew constant patrols to protect their retreating ground units. Anti-aircraft guns were repositioned every few hours. Machine gun nests controlled every valley and road. And perhaps worst of all, German observation balloons, high-value intelligence hubs, were deployed in staggering numbers. These balloons were floating command posts. They directed artillery fire. They spotted infantry movement. They monitored tank advances. Destroying a balloon could save thousands of American lives, but attacking one was suicide. Each balloon was protected by layers of defenses, machine gun nests, anti-aircraft batteries, fighter escorts, and rapid-lift hydraulic winches that could yank the balloon to the ground in seconds. Most pilots refused balloon attacks. Rickenbacker volunteered for them. Balloon busting required a different mindset than aerial dogfighting. Against a fighter plane, you faced a thinking enemy, one who responded to fear, instinct, and misdirection. But a balloon was a fortified target. Everything around it existed solely to kill the attacker. There was no element of surprise, no psychological edge, only brute risk. In early October, Rickenbacker decided to attack his first balloon of the campaign. He approached at low altitude, using hills as cover. He throttled down, maintaining just enough speed to stay airborne. He flew dangerously close to the ground, so low his wheels nearly clipped treetops. Then, when he was almost directly beneath the balloon, he punched the throttle to maximum, pulled upward into a steep climb, and fired a stream of incendiary rounds. The balloon burst into flames. Instantly, anti-aircraft guns opened fire from every direction. Machine gun tracers streaked past his wings. A German fighter section dove at him from the clouds. But Rickenbacker had studied every route, every angle of escape. He dove back toward the hills, weaving between ridges and hedgerows, using the terrain to break line of sight with the enemy. He returned home safely. The squadron celebrated. Rickenbacker simply wrote a 2-sentence entry in his journal. Balloon destroyed. Escaped without damage. It was as if he considered it routine. But nothing about it was routine. In the days that followed, he destroyed more balloons. Each attack was a life-or-death engagement. Each one required deep planning and even deeper nerve. By mid-October, balloon hunting became his specialty, and Germany took notice.
As Rickenbacker's victories mounted, German command posts intercepted increasingly frequent radio reports that mentioned the lone American SPAD pilot. German reconnaissance teams, artillery spotters, and balloon observers filed reports describing a single, disciplined attacker who struck suddenly and vanished into clouds or terrain. It didn't take long for the Germans to figure out who he was. They assigned fighter units specifically to intercept him. They altered balloon deployment schedules. They increased anti-aircraft density in sectors he frequented. And in several cases, they launched decoy patrols, German fighters pretending to be vulnerable, to lure him into traps. This wasn't just a pilot fighting a war. This was a pilot being hunted. Yet Rickenbacker adapted. He studied German deployment maps. He noted balloon replacement intervals. He learned the timing patterns of German patrol rotations, and he used this to outmaneuver them. On October 10th alone, he shot down 2 German fighters and a balloon, all in a single day. His squadron was stunned. American newspapers began printing headlines about the lone wolf ace, but Rickenbacker did not revel in fame. In fact, he often seemed burdened by it. People imagined the sky to be a place of glory. They never imagined the silence after a fight. They never imagined returning alone. This wasn't ego. It was the realism of a man who knew every flight could be his last. As Rickenbacker grew more confident in solo missions, he began flying what pilots called deep penetration patrols, missions far behind enemy lines, often with no backup and no chance of rescue. These missions had several purposes: intercepting German reconnaissance planes, mapping troop movements, disrupting withdrawal columns, attacking stragglers, engaging isolated fighter formations, searching for observation balloons, and gathering intelligence for the American First Army. Flying deep into enemy territory required a level of calm most pilots simply didn't have. If his engine sputtered, he died. If he was wounded, he crashed. If he was forced down, he was captured. If he encountered a German patrol, he had to fight outnumbered. But Rickenbacker approached these missions the same way he approached everything, as a mechanical problem with multiple solutions. He memorized enemy airfields. He memorized anti-aircraft arcs. He memorized river paths, mountain ridges, and retreat corridors. He flew using fuel calculations so precise that co-pilots were amazed he could return without running dry. During these missions, he continued scoring victories. Clean, efficient, almost clinical victories. One German pilot he shot down later told interrogators, "He did not fight like a human. He fought like a machine built for a single purpose." October 1918 became the most legendary month of Rickenbacker's military career. Between October 1st and October 30th, he shot down 14 enemy aircraft, including 5 balloons. No American pilot had ever achieved that pace, and no one has matched it since. His discipline reached its peak. His tactical instincts were flawless. His solo methods became textbook maneuvers for future generations of pilots. He was now the undisputed ace of aces. But what made this period extraordinary wasn't just the numbers. It was the transformation of a man who had entered the war with doubt, insecurity, and fear, and who now flew with a level of clarity that terrifies anyone who understands aviation combat. He didn't rely on luck. He didn't rely on daring. He relied on precision. He once wrote, "A pilot with discipline can outfight a pilot with courage." And by the end of the war, his discipline was unmatched. In the final days of October, as negotiations for an armistice accelerated, German flight activity decreased. Their resources were depleted. Fuel was scarce. Engines were worn. Their best pilots were gone. Rickenbacker, however, continued flying, not because he wanted victory, but because he believed every mission might protect American infantry in the final critical push. His last confirmed victory came on October 30th, 1918. Not a dramatic dogfight, not a balloon attack, simply a clean, disciplined engagement. One last precise act from a warrior who had mastered his craft. On November 11th, the war ended. When the guns fell silent, Eddie Rickenbacker had achieved what no American before him had done. 26 confirmed victories, countless reconnaissance missions, and a legacy built on discipline, not glory. He landed his Spad for the final time as a soldier. He stepped out of the cockpit exhausted, thinner than when he began, and carrying the memories of dozens of friends who never returned. He didn't celebrate. He didn't cheer. He simply stood on the airfield and listened to the silence that replaced the roar of engines and the crack of gunfire. The war was over, but his story was not.
The last days of the Great War unfolded not with triumph, but with exhaustion. The Western Front, once a roaring machine of artillery, infantry waves, and aerial duels, was collapsing under its own weight. German morale was shattered. Their supply lines crumbled. Their pilots were flying on worn engines and dwindling fuel. Their infantry marched with hollow eyes. And high above this unraveling world, Eddie Rickenbacker flew on. He had survived the deadliest months of aviation combat. He had faced Germany's best pilots. He had destroyed balloons that were considered suicide targets. He had flown deeper into enemy territory than any pilot in his unit. And yet, as October rolled into November, he knew something had changed. The skies were emptying. The thunder of engines was fading. The great aerial war was dying. But Rickenbacker refused to relax. Not yet. Not until it was truly over. This final section tells the story of his last days in the air, his return home, and the legacy that transformed him from a race car driver with a dream into America's most iconic aviator. By the final week of October 1918, even the bravest pilots in the 94th Aero Squadron were breaking down under exhaustion. The tempo of Allied operations was relentless, and Germany's desperation made every remaining engagement unpredictable. Some German pilots were inexperienced teenagers sent up in obsolete aircraft. Others were hardened veterans fighting with the ferocity of soldiers who knew the war was slipping away. For Rickenbacker, this made the final missions more dangerous than ever. Desperation, he believed, was more dangerous than skill. And yet he flew, every morning, every afternoon,
every time his engine was ready. On October 28th, he embarked on one of his most exhausting patrols of the war. Cloud cover was thick, visibility was nearly zero, the wind was vicious, but Rickenbacker pressed forward, believing German units might use the poor weather to conceal withdrawal movements. He flew alone, again. After nearly an hour of scanning gray skies and broken trenches below, he spotted movement. 2 German two-seat reconnaissance planes flying low, escorted by a pair of Fokker D-7s. Most pilots would have turned back, but Rickenbacker saw a familiar pattern. The escorts were positioned too tightly, almost overlapping wings, a sign of nervous pilots. He dove straight down. One burst, the first Fokker spiraled. A quick banking turn. The second escort panicked and broke left. Rickenbacker didn't chase. Instead, he went for the reconnaissance plane, the true threat. 5 seconds later, the German machine was burning. He returned home exhausted and barely able to speak. It was his second-to-last kill. 2 days later, Rickenbacker secured his final victory. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a balloon bursting into flames or a daring dogfight against multiple opponents. It was a clean, disciplined engagement, the outcome of methodical planning. He spotted a Halberstadt CL-2, a 2-seater ground attack and reconnaissance aircraft flying low over retreating German infantry. Rickenbacker didn't hesitate. He dove, fired a controlled burst, then broke away before the rear gunner could track him. The Halberstadt fell. This was victory number 26. He didn't celebrate. He simply flew back to the airfield, stepped out of his Spad, and looked around at the exhausted faces of the men who had survived with him. The war wasn't officially over yet, but deep down, every pilot knew the end was close. On the morning of November 11, 1918, the pilots of the 94th Aero Squadron gathered around a small radio set inside their headquarters hut. Word was spreading. Germany had agreed to an armistice. At 11 a.m., the guns would fall silent. Rickenbacker was in the air when the moment arrived. He insisted on flying a patrol that morning. Call it discipline, call it habit, or call it a refusal to let others face danger while he stayed on the ground. Whatever the reason, he took off alone, climbing into the cold November sky one last time. At exactly 11 a.m., the front lines stopped firing. Artillery fell silent. Machine guns ceased. Even the sky, which had echoed with engines for 4 straight years, grew still. Rickenbacker was airborne when the world entered peace. He later wrote, "Never had I heard such silence. It was as though the air itself exhaled." He circled once, twice, and then headed back to his airfield. When he landed, ground crews rushed toward him, not in celebration, but in relief. They were alive. The war was over, and the man who had become the steady heartbeat of the squadron had returned home safely. When Rickenbacker returned to the United States, he was stunned by what he found. Newspapers hailed him as a national hero. Magazines printed his photograph across their covers. Reporters swarmed him at train stations. Thousands gathered to see the ace of aces in person. But Rickenbacker resisted fame. He didn't like boasting about his victories. He didn't enjoy the spotlight. He rarely spoke of the men he shot down because he believed glorifying combat was dangerous. He once told a journalist, "I did my job. Many men did theirs better. Many never returned to tell their story." Still, the American public needed heroes, and they embraced him with open arms. He became a symbol of American precision, discipline, and courage at a time when the nation was struggling to understand the scale of the war it had just fought.